They soared through the skies of a fledgling Hyrule, magnificent companions bonded to every child of Skyloft, and then they vanished without a trace. The Loftwings of Skyward Sword are nowhere to be found in any subsequent Zelda game, not in Ocarina of Time, not in Breath of the Wild, not even in Tears of the Kingdom. How does an entire species just disappear from the timeline? Was it evolution, environmental catastrophe, or something far more mysterious tied to the very fabric of Hyrule's creation? Buckle up, because we're diving deep into one of the Zelda franchise's most haunting mysteries. Before we unravel this enigma, let's establish what we're dealing with. Skyward Sword takes place at the absolute beginning of the Zelda timeline. This is the founding moment of Hyrule itself. The game introduced players to Skyloft, a civilization floating high above the clouds on massive islands. But Skyloft wasn't just about floating islands and ancient technology. It was about the bond between humans and Loftwings. These weren't just any birds. Loftwings were enormous, majestic avian creatures that came in multiple colors: crimson red like Link's companion, sapphire blue, emerald green, and more. Each resident of Skyloft received their Loftwing during a coming-of-age ceremony, forming a sacred bond that would last their entire lifetime. This wasn't transportation, this was partnership, loyalty, friendship forged in the skies themselves. The Loftwings served as the primary means of travel between the various islands of Skyloft. Without them, the civilization couldn't function. Players spent hours soaring through the air, diving through rings, racing against opponents, and using these incredible creatures to navigate the world. The bond between Link and his Crimson Loftwing was central to the entire game's narrative and gameplay experience. But here's where things get disturbing. After the events of Skyward Sword, after Link defeats Demise, after Zelda chooses to remain on the surface, after the establishment of what would become Hyrule, the Loftwings are never mentioned again. Not once. Thousands of years of Hyrule's history spanning multiple timelines, and these magnificent creatures have completely disappeared from historical records, from legends, from existence itself. Let's think about how massive this disappearance really is. We're not talking about some obscure species that lived in one remote corner of Hyrule. We're talking about creatures that were absolutely fundamental to an entire civilization. Every single person in Skyloft had a Loftwing companion. These birds were woven into their culture, their religion, their daily survival. And yet, nothing. Radio silence across millennia. The first major theory we need to examine is perhaps the simplest, but also the most unsettling. What if Nintendo simply wrote them out of existence? What if there's no grand in-universe explanation, just a creative decision to streamline the lore for future games? From a game design perspective, this actually makes some sense. When Ocarina of Time was developed in 1998, the developers were creating the foundation of Hyrule's mythology without knowing that Skyward Sword would eventually establish prehistory 14 years later. They were building a medieval fantasy kingdom, not planning for sky whale birds from a floating civilization in the distant past. Each subsequent Zelda game built upon this established aesthetic. Hyrule is a land-based kingdom with horses, forests, mountains, and traditional medieval elements. Introducing Loftwings would have required massive world-building adjustments. How would they fit in Hyrule Field? Where would they live? How would NPCs interact with them? The practical complications multiply endlessly. But here's what makes this theory particularly chilling. If Nintendo deliberately omitted the Loftwings for creative convenience, it means they're acknowledging that some elements of the timeline simply don't connect. It suggests that Hyrule's history isn't a carefully planned tapestry, but rather a collection of individual stories that sometimes contradict each other. And fans have noticed this disconnect. The Zelda community has debated for years whether the official timeline even makes logical sense, or if it was retrofitted to connect games that were never intended to be chronologically linked. The Loftwings' disappearance becomes evidence in this larger debate about narrative consistency versus creative freedom. However, there's something that doesn't quite add up with the Nintendo forgot theory. The developers have demonstrated incredible attention to detail when connecting games across the timeline. They've included references to previous games, maintained consistent lore about the Triforce, the Master Sword, and various races like the Zora and Gorons. Would they really just abandon such a significant element without some in-universe explanation? This brings us to our second major theory, one that's far more intriguing from a biological perspective. What if the Loftwings didn't disappear, but evolved? Think about what happened at the end of Skyward Sword. Link and Zelda chose to remain on the surface, establishing the foundation of what would become Hyrule. Other residents of Skyloft eventually followed, descending from the clouds to build civilization on the land below. This migration represents a fundamental shift in how humanity interacted with their environment. For thousands of years, humans lived exclusively in the sky. Their entire society was built around aerial travel and sky-based resources. The Loftwings were perfectly adapted to this environment. They were powerful flyers, capable of carrying human passengers across vast distances, navigating between floating islands with ease. But what happens when that environment changes? What happens when the humans, who relied on them for millennia, suddenly move to the surface permanently? The Loftwings face a crucial evolutionary pressure: adapt or perish. Consider the ecological challenges. The surface wasn't empty when the Skyloftians arrived. It was teeming with monsters, dangerous wildlife, and unexplored territories. The ecosystem down below would have been completely different from the open skies. Different food sources, different predators, different climate patterns, different nesting requirements. The Loftwings would need to adapt to this new environment rapidly. And we know from real-world evolutionary biology that birds are actually incredibly adaptable. On Earth, we've seen bird species evolve dramatically in response to environmental changes, developing new beak shapes for different food sources, altering migration patterns, even developing flightlessness when aerial predators are absent. So here's the compelling part. What if the Loftwings gradually evolved into other avian species we see throughout Hyrule's history? What if their descendants are hiding in plain sight, transformed by thousands of years of natural selection? The most obvious candidates are the Rito. In the Wind Waker, we encounter this bird-like race that can transform into avian forms and fly. The Rito explicitly evolved from the Zora in that timeline, according to Hyrule Historia. But what if the Loftwings' genetics played a role in that transformation? What if there was interbreeding between species, or environmental factors influenced by dormant Loftwing DNA? Wait, that doesn't quite work because the Rito evolution is specifically documented as coming from the Zora. But here's where it gets interesting. In Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the Rito are different from the Wind Waker version. They're a separate evolution that doesn't come from Zora at all. They're native bird people who've always existed in this version of Hyrule. Could these Rito be the descendants of the Loftwings? Think about it. They're large avian creatures. They have intelligence suggesting a long history of evolution alongside humans. They inhabit the Hebra region with its high altitudes and mountain peaks, environments that would be perfect for creatures originally adapted to sky dwelling. The timeline placement works too. Breath of the Wild takes place at least 10,000 years after Skyward Sword, possibly much longer. That's more than enough time for significant evolutionary changes. The Loftwings could have gradually adapted to ground-based life, developed greater intelligence, formed complex societies, and eventually became the Rito civilization we know today. But the Rito aren't the only possibility. What about all the other bird species we see throughout Hyrule's history? The messenger owls in Ocarina of Time, the various hawk and eagle species in Twilight Princess, even the cuckoos that appear in virtually every Zelda game. Now, cuckoos being descended from Loftwings might seem absurd at first, but consider this. Domestication can cause radical changes in animal species incredibly quickly. Dogs evolved from wolves in just 15,000 years, and look at the difference between a wolf and a chihuahua. If humans domesticated some Loftwings for farming purposes after settling on the surface, rapid selective breeding could have produced the cuckoos we know today, smaller, less aggressive, but still retaining that legendary cuckoo fury when provoked.
The genetic evidence is tantalizing, but there's a darker possibility within this evolutionary theory. What if the Loftwings didn't successfully adapt? What if environmental pressures were too severe and they simply went extinct? Mass extinction events are terrifyingly common in natural history. On Earth, we've had 5 major extinction events, and countless species have vanished due to environmental changes they couldn't survive. The Loftwings faced unprecedented challenges when humans moved to the surface.
First, there's the question of food sources. What did Loftwings eat in the sky? The game never explicitly shows us, but they likely relied on fish from sky-based water sources, perhaps certain types of airborne insects, maybe specialized plants growing on the floating islands. None of these would exist on the surface in the same way. Second, breeding grounds. If Loftwings nested on the floating islands of Skyloft, they might have been unable to reproduce successfully in ground-based environments. Many real-world bird species are incredibly specific about nesting locations. Certain penguins return to the exact same spot every year. Some seabirds nest only on particular types of cliffs. If Loftwings had similar restrictions, their reproductive success on the surface could have collapsed. Third, predation pressure. The surface was filled with monsters after Skyward Sword. Bokoblins, moblins, dangerous wildlife, all potential threats to Loftwing populations. In the sky, these creatures were protected by their aerial environment. On the ground, they'd be vulnerable to predators they'd never encountered before. And finally, the most heartbreaking possibility, abandonment. As humans established permanent settlements on the surface, began using horses for transportation, and adapted to land-based life, they might have simply stopped caring for their Loftwing companions. The sacred bond that defined Skyloftian culture could have weakened and eventually broken entirely. Imagine the tragedy of that scenario. These loyal creatures, bonded to humans for generations, slowly abandoned as their partners embraced a new way of life. Loftwings separated from their riders, unable to understand why their lifelong companions no longer needed them. A slow, sad decline into extinction. But wait, there's a third theory that's far more mystical and potentially the most significant of all. What if the Loftwings' existence wasn't purely biological, but spiritual? Let's examine the evidence for this. Skyward Sword is steeped in divine imagery and spiritual significance. The goddess Hyrulean created Skyloft specifically to protect humanity from demise and his forces. She raised the islands into the sky using her divine power, establishing a sanctuary beyond the reach of evil. Everything about Skyloft's existence was magical, supernatural, intentional. What if the Loftwings weren't natural creatures at all, but manifestations of Hyrulean's divine will? What if she created them specifically to serve humanity during their time in the sky, bonding each child to a companion that would keep them safe in that aerial environment? This theory gains weight when we consider Link's Crimson Loftwing specifically. This bird is unique. It's the only red Loftwing shown in the entire game, and according to Skyloft's legends, a red Loftwing is a sign of incredible destiny, only appearing to those chosen by the goddess herself. That's not just rare genetics, that's divine intervention. If the Loftwings were created by Hyrulean for a specific purpose, then their purpose was fulfilled when humanity returned to the surface. The goddess's plan succeeded, demise was defeated, the Triforce was secured, and humanity could reclaim the land below. With their divine purpose complete, perhaps the Loftwings simply ceased to exist. Think about how other divine or magical elements behave in the Zelda series. The Oka in Twilight Princess are described as ancient sky beings close to the gods, but they're limited to the city in the sky. The Windfish in Link's Awakening creates an entire island through dreaming, but that island vanishes when the fish awakens. Magical creatures in Zelda consistently exist only as long as they're needed for a specific purpose. What if the Loftwings didn't die, didn't evolve, didn't migrate, but simply returned to the divine realm from which they came? Their physical forms could have dissolved, their spirits returning to whatever celestial plane Hyrulean created them from. One day they were there, magnificent and vital, and the next, gone, like a dream fading upon waking. There's actually some textual evidence supporting this interpretation.
In Skyward Sword, various characters reference the spirit of the sky and the sacred nature of flying. The entire culture of Skyloft treats flying as a spiritual practice, not merely transportation. The wing ceremony isn't just a race, it's a religious ritual. The relationship between rider and Loftwing is described in almost mystical terms. And here's something that sends chills down the spine. Link's Crimson Loftwing appears to him in moments of great need, almost as if responding to his spirit rather than a physical summons. The bond between them transcends normal animal-human relationships. It's telepathic, instinctive, magical in nature.
If this bond was spiritual rather than purely physical, then the Loftwings' disappearance takes on an entirely different meaning. They didn't die or evolve, they became part of Hyrule's spiritual landscape. Perhaps they exist now as guardian spirits, invisible protectors watching over Hyrule from the heavens. This would explain why no physical evidence of Loftwings exists in later games. No fossils, no ancient texts describing them, no archaeological remains. If they were never fully physical to begin with, there'd be nothing left to find. Their absence from history makes perfect sense because they existed partly outside of history. But there's an even deeper implication here, one that connects to the very nature of the Master Sword itself. Stay with me on this because it gets complex. The Master Sword was forged during the events of Skyward Sword, transforming from the Goddess Sword through trials and sacred flames. Its entire purpose is to seal away evil, to serve as a key to defeating darkness throughout time. The sword itself is intrinsically linked to the goddess Hylia and her divine plan. What if the Loftwings' existence was tied to the Master Sword's creation? What if they were manifestations of the same divine energy that eventually became concentrated in the blade? As the sword was forged and completed, perhaps the Loftwings' essence was drawn into it, their skybound spirits becoming part of the weapon's power. This would explain the Master Sword's ability to cut through darkness, to seal evil, to choose worthy wielders. It contains within it the loyal, protective spirit of the Loftwings themselves. Every time Link draws the Master Sword in subsequent games, he's wielding not just metal and magic, but the very essence of those ancient Sky Guardians. Look at the sword's design, the blue blade, the Triforce emblazoned on the hilt, the wings extending from the crossguard. Those aren't just decorative elements, they're literal representations of the Loftwings. The sword's silhouette echoes a bird in flight. It's been hiding in plain sight across the entire series. When Link swings the Master Sword, when it fires sword beams, when it resonates with sacred power, maybe that's the Loftwings' final form. They didn't vanish, they transformed into something even greater, becoming an eternal weapon against evil rather than temporary companions bound to mortal lifespans. This theory elegantly solves several mysteries at once. It explains the Loftwings' complete absence in later games, their lack of fossil evidence, why Skyloft culture didn't preserve detailed records about them, and even why the Master Sword has such profound significance beyond just being a powerful weapon. But let's address the elephant in the room, or rather, the Loftwing not in the room. If any of these theories are correct, why doesn't anyone in later Hyrule acknowledge this history? Why are there no myths, legends, or even fragmented stories about the Loftwings? The answer might be simpler and sadder than we think: time and cultural amnesia. Consider how much of real human history has been lost. Ancient civilizations, technologies, knowledge systems that took generations to develop, all gone, surviving only as scattered archaeological fragments or not at all. And Hyrule has experienced multiple apocalyptic events across its timeline. The Great Flood that created the Great Sea in Wind Waker, that destroyed virtually all records of old Hyrule. The Calamity in Breath of the Wild, it wiped out not just cities, but entire historical archives. Hyrule goes through cycles of prosperity and destruction, and with each catastrophe, more knowledge is lost. If Skyloft's written records were primarily kept on the floating islands, and those islands eventually fell or abandoned, then everything about that culture could have been lost. The Loftwings would become just another casualty of historical amnesia, forgotten like so many other elements of the ancient past. There's also the possibility of deliberate suppression. What if knowledge about the Loftwings was intentionally erased? Perhaps later rulers of Hyrule wanted to cement their authority by controlling the historical narrative.
If the Skyloftians represented a pre-kingdom power structure, eliminating references to them would help establish the new order. Or consider this, what if the knowledge about Loftwings was preserved only in specific places or among certain groups? The Sheikah, as keepers of ancient wisdom, might know about them. The royal family of Hyrule, passing down secret histories from generation to generation, might preserve the truth. But this knowledge would be hidden, esoteric, unavailable to common people or even scholars.
In Breath of the Wild, we discover that the Sheikah had incredibly advanced technology 10,000 years ago, technology that was deliberately buried and forgotten by later generations who feared it. If they could erase knowledge of their own achievements, they could certainly erase knowledge of ancient sky creatures. The pattern throughout Zelda's timeline is consistent. Hyrule forgets. Knowledge is lost, rediscovered, lost again. The cycle of amnesia repeats across millennia. The Loftwings aren't unique in being forgotten, they're just one more casualty of time's relentless march. But here's what makes the Loftwings special among all these forgotten elements. Unlike ancient technology or lost kingdoms, they were living beings. They had relationships with people. They were loved, bonded companions who trusted humans completely. And somehow, despite that profound connection, they were still forgotten. That's the real tragedy at the heart of this mystery. It's not just about a missing species or an unexplained plot hole. It's about how even the most meaningful relationships, the most sacred bonds, can be lost to time. It's about the impermanence of memory and the fragility of history. Link's Crimson Loftwing saved his life countless times during Skyward Sword. It carried him between islands, helped him in races, was there during his most critical moments. The bond between them was unbreakable, eternal, sacred. And yet, by the time of Ocarina of Time, no one even remembers that such creatures existed. If we accept that the Loftwings existed and then vanished, whether through evolution, extinction, spiritual transformation, or historical amnesia, we're confronted with an uncomfortable truth about the Zelda universe itself. Nothing is permanent. Even the most fundamental aspects of Hyrule's identity can be erased, forgotten, transformed beyond recognition. The races that exist in one era are gone in the next. The Kokiri become the Koroks. The Zora split into river-dwelling and ocean-dwelling variants. Entire civilizations rise and fall. The geography itself changes dramatically between games. Hyrule is in constant flux, constantly reinventing itself. But should we find this depressing? Maybe not. Maybe the Loftwings' disappearance actually reveals something beautiful about the Zelda series. Think about it this way. Every game presents a new Hyrule, a new interpretation of the legend. The developers aren't constrained by rigid continuity demands. They can explore new ideas, introduce new mechanics, create fresh experiences without being chained to every detail from previous games. The Loftwings served their purpose perfectly in Skyward Sword. They enabled incredible gameplay, created emotional connections, enhanced the story's themes of companionship and destiny. And then, having fulfilled that role, they bowed out gracefully, making room for new elements in future games. Maybe that's the ultimate answer to this mystery. The Loftwings didn't need to appear in other games because their story was complete. They existed when and where they were needed, told the story they needed to tell, and then became part of Hyrule's mythic tapestry. In a franchise about the eternal cycle of heroism, courage, and the struggle against darkness, perhaps the Loftwings represent something equally eternal, the idea that companions, helpers, and guardians will always appear when needed, even if their forms change across time. Link has had many companions throughout the series. Navi, the fairy, Epona, the horse, Midna, the Twilight Princess, Fi, the spirit of the sword, Zelda herself in various incarnations. The specific companion changes, but the concept remains constant. Link is never truly alone in his quest. The Loftwings might be gone, but their spirit lives on in every companion who aids Link's journey. In Epona's loyalty, in Navi's guidance, in the wild horses of Breath of the Wild that Link can tame and bond with. The bond between hero and companion, between human and animal, between courage and support, that transcends any individual species. So where did the Loftwings go?
Perhaps the answer is everywhere. They're in the Rito's wings, in the Master Sword's power, in the forgotten histories of Hyrule, in the very concept of loyal companionship that defines the series. They didn't disappear, they dispersed, becoming part of Hyrule's DNA rather than a specific visible element. Or maybe, just maybe, they're still out there somewhere. What if in some remote corner of Hyrule that we haven't explored yet, a small population of Loftwings survived, hidden in mountain peaks beyond the reach of maps, living in isolation, waiting for the day when humanity might need Sky Guardians once again?
Future Zelda games could still reveal their fate. Nintendo could provide a canonical answer in a future title, connecting the dots between Skyward Sword's sky civilization and the land-based kingdoms that followed. Until then, the mystery remains tantalizingly open. And honestly, maybe that's exactly how it should be. The greatest mysteries in fiction are often those left partially unexplained, allowing fans to theorize, debate, and imagine their own answers. The Loftwings' disappearance has sparked countless discussions, inspired fan art, generated theories both wild and plausible. That engagement, that creativity from the community, that keeps the Loftwings alive far more effectively than any canonical explanation could. Every fan theory is a memorial to these magnificent creatures. Every discussion thread is an acknowledgement that they mattered, that they're remembered even if Hyrule itself forgot. So let's talk about it. What's your theory about the Loftwings' fate? Do you believe they evolved into the Rito, their genetics passing down through millennia? Do you think they went extinct, unable to adapt to the surface's harsh environment? Do you subscribe to the spiritual theory, imagining them as divine beings who returned to the heavens after their purpose was fulfilled? Maybe you have a completely different theory we haven't explored. Maybe you've noticed details in the games that provide clues we've overlooked. Maybe you have evidence from official guidebooks, developer interviews, or the Hyrule Historia that sheds new light on this mystery. The comment section is yours. Share your thoughts, your theories, your insights. If you're an artist, show us your interpretation of what happened to the Loftwings. If you're a lore expert, point us toward information we might have missed. If you're new to the series, tell us what you think as a fresh perspective. This mystery is one of the most intriguing unanswered questions in the entire Zelda franchise. The Loftwings were such an integral part of Skyward Sword's identity, such magnificent and memorable creatures, that their complete absence from subsequent games demands explanation. Whether that explanation comes from Nintendo or from the fan community's collective imagination, it's a conversation worth having. Because at the end of the day, the Zelda series is about more than just solving dungeons and defeating Ganon. It's about exploring a rich, complex world full of history and mystery. It's about piecing together fragments of lore across games separated by years or even decades of development. It's about the joy of discovery, the thrill of theory crafting, the satisfaction of connecting dots that the developers might not have even intentionally placed. The Loftwings might be gone from Hyrule's skies, but they're not gone from our memories. They soared, they bonded with their riders, they embodied the spirit of freedom and companionship. And as long as players keep returning to Skyward Sword, keep experiencing that opening sequence where Link first leaps onto his crimson Loftwing's back, keep feeling the wind and the exhilaration of flight, the Loftwings will never truly disappear. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of Zelda's most profound mysteries. If you enjoyed this exploration, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more Zelda lore deep dives, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future mysteries we'll be unraveling. And remember, the legend continues, the cycle repeats, and somewhere in Hyrule's vast history, the answers we seek might still be waiting to be discovered. The Loftwing story might not be over after all. We just haven't reached the chapter where it continues. Until next time, keep exploring, keep theorizing, and may the goddess watch over you, whether from the sky above or from the blade of the Master Sword itself.